December 2019, a pneumonia-type virus begins to spread in China. Within weeks, the entire city is sealed off.
Drastic measures to halt the spread of that deadly virus. Wuhan, China, ground zero for the outbreak, now under lockdown.
Initial reports focused on a wet market as the origin of the virus.
Most of the patients are reported to have worked at a local seafood market. They said there was no reason to suspect the virus was transmitted through humans.
A storyline pushed heavily by the Chinese government and by the World Health Organization. But critics take notice of the market's proximity to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a world-leading center for research on bat coronaviruses.
We also know that just a few miles away from that food market is China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory that researches human infectious diseases.
In February 2020, Senator Tom Cotton said the U.S. government was investigating whether the virus came from the lab. The media responded by mocking him, calling him a fringe conspiracy theorist playing a dangerous game.
This question about the Wuhan lab, we know that it's been debunked that this virus was man-made or modified or anything like that.
All the while, the World Health Organization continued to give cover to China. This past March, it concluded in a joint report with the Chinese that the lab leak hypothesis was extremely unlikely, despite WHO investigators spending just hours on the ground in China without access to records, samples, or key personnel.
Were there Chinese government minders in the room every time you were asking questions?
There were Ministry of Foreign Affairs staff in the room throughout our stay, absolutely. They were there to make sure everything went smoothly from the China side.
In May, under pressure, President Biden ordered intel officials to redouble efforts to investigate the theory.
We have to have access. The world has to have access.
Senator Rand Paul says this fight is not just about China. It's also about how the scientists who study potentially deadly viruses are funded by the U.S. government.
Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress.
But now Fauci's denial is coming under new scrutiny. This week, The Intercept published documents reportedly showing the agency Fauci leads knowingly funded research into bat coronaviruses that were deliberately manipulated to the huge known risk of mankind.
All the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating.
What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
That is
Can't
not...
get away from it.
And if anybody is lying here, Senator, it is you.
Joining me now, Senator Rand Paul. Senator, great to be with you again. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks for having me.
That is unbelievable. I mean, what happened, we've known it, but now we see the supporting documentation, and it was worse than we knew. The NIH and Fauci's organization within the NIH, the NIAID, was offering grants, was funding grants, not just approving them. They were funding this group by this guy, Peter Daszak, EcoHealth Alliance. And that group was absolutely doing bat coronavirus research in Wuhan at the lab. And it was gain-of-function research to try to take these bat coronaviruses and make them more transmissible, more dangerous to humans. They did it for, supposedly good reasons, to try to investigate the consequences to public health. But that was happening. And that's exactly what Fauci told you was a lie in that exchange.
I was kind of surprised by his answer. I actually thought he would back down a little bit and say, well, in retrospect, we made an error. But he's actually doubled down. And really, his opinion hasn't changed since 2012, when he said that, yes, a scientist could become infected. Yes, a pandemic could occur coming from a lab. But even if it happened, the research would be worth it. Even after 4 million people have died, in retrospect, he's still unwilling to look back and say, my goodness, 4 million people died. If this came from an experiment in the lab, shouldn't we do something differently? The latest material that came from The Intercept through the Freedom of Information Act actually shows now that the funding goes on through 2025. So I passed an amendment about a month ago unanimously to say no more funding to Wuhan Institute from the U.S. taxpayer. It hasn't been signed into law, but it passed unanimously in the U.S. Senate. And yet Dr. Fauci, Peter Daszak, they're still spending money with the Wuhan lab. They have not learned a thing.
I mean, it's chilling to think about the fact that this may have come from this Wuhan lab and that it may have been funded in part to some extent by the American government. That the man we've been looking to and trusting as our chief authority on all things COVID for the past 18, 19 months, Dr. Fauci, may have been part of the group that approved the very project that ultimately endangered billions of people and cost 4 million lives so far. I mean, that's what it looks like. It looks like Peter Daszak's group was funding, if not the exact research that led to COVID, that this branch of coronavirus, then one that was very close to it.
Yeah, and this is sort of this game that Dr. Fauci plays. In the end, he responds and says, well, the virus in question is molecularly so different from COVID, it couldn't have been the COVID-19. But we've never alleged that. If it were COVID-19, everybody would know that. It's a virus using gain-of-function techniques that was made to be more transmissible in humans. That's what gain-of-function research is. But not one interviewer, when he goes on to mainstream TV, which is all he does, mainstream left-wing TV, they yuck it up, they laugh, they chortle, they think how hilarious these conspiracy theories are, but never once does someone ask him, why is this not gain-of-function research? What they were doing was taking the SARS virus, which is a coronavirus. This caused a pandemic in 2004. It was very deadly, 15% mortality, but not very transmissible. So you have a very deadly virus that doesn't easily infect people. It doesn't go very far. Now, how smart would it be to take a very deadly virus that's not very transmissible and add different S protein genes to it to see if you could make it more transmissible? So in one of the experiments, they got 8 brand new viruses from a cave, hunting around in a cave in South China. They bring it. They take the genes for the S protein on the unknown viruses, and they combine it with the SARS backbone genome, and then they reverse the transcription to make a virus. And lo and behold, they found at least 2 out of the 8 were transmissible to humans. So they have created something that doesn't exist in nature. And in fact, their argument that, we can use this to study how to make vaccines, it's not how we make vaccines now. We don't make vaccines based on a novel virus that doesn't occur in nature. We actually have the ability, which is incredible technology. And I think ultimately history will judge the development of the vaccine as one of the most incredible scientific developments in such a short period of time. But we can take a brand new virus that's infecting people and making them sick, and we can sequence its genome. They have automated technology. They can do this within days. They can develop a vaccine within days to an existing pathogen. There's no reason to create pathogens to study for vaccines anymore. The technology has gone beyond that. And so I'm calling not only for an end to the funding in China, I don't think we should be creating these super viruses in the United States either, because I think there's a potential that we create something that is so terrible that it may cause, incredibly more harm than this one even did.
That's a great point. And that's the sort of the sequencing that happened in China is important because while Fauci denies gain-of-function research was done with any U.S. money, these documents obtained by The Intercept contain several critical details about the research happening in Wuhan by our guys with American money, including key experimental.
Yeah.
But let me just finish this point, including key experimental work with humanized mice conducted at the lab in Wuhan Center. All right, so they were taking mice with more human characteristics to see if they could infect them with this terrible COVID version, not COVID-19, but a terrible version of COVID. And literally, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed by 2 really smart guys, Stephen Quay and Richard Muller, a couple months ago, saying, here's what happened. We actually looked at the genome of COVID-19, and we are telling you that optimization of this virus has happened before it got to us. It suggests a long period of adaptation that predated the spread, not of the virus that they were working on under Daszak, but of COVID-19 itself. They said, science knows of only one way this could be achieved: simulated natural evolution, growing the virus on human cells until the optimum is achieved. That's precisely what is done in gain-of-function research. Mice that are are genetically modified to have the same coronavirus receptor as humans, called humanized mice, are repeatedly exposed to the virus to encourage adaptation. That is what they are seeing in COVID-19, and it's what these documents show we were funding the experiments on in these other COVID viruses that Dr. Fauci takes no responsibility for.
Right. And so, we'll never know for certain that it came from the lab. Here's the evidence for it. Number one, they've studied 80,000 animals in those wet markets, and not one of them has COVID. The other thing is we take COVID-19 that's available in humans and being transmitted human to human, and then they try to reinfect bats. And they find that COVID-19 is more adapted for humans than bats. So if it came from bats through an intermediate host, there still should be some infectivity back to either a host or to bats. And they find that it's more adapted to humans, which makes people very, very suspicious that this was pre-adapted. Some of the scientists have said this didn't evolve. It was pre-adapted to be successful in humans. Mm-hmm. And that's very, very worrisome. And even the possibility of that should give us pause. But Dr. Fauci was asked a month ago by Senator Kennedy in committee, do you trust the Chinese? And he said, well, that's where the bat viruses are. It would be malpractice not to go there. Well, it's one thing to study the bat viruses. It's another to trust the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Some of the virology labs are populated with people directly from the military. Now, while I don't think this was released on purpose as a bioweapon, I think they do study bioweapons. And I think that the Chinese communists have shown themselves not to be trustworthy. But the fact that Dr. Fauci still considers themselves to be trustworthy, that he's still funding this Chinese lab, shows him to be unfit to be in any position of authority.
So that's it exactly. We have yet another look by our intel community at how this thing originated, and it was utterly useless. It was rushed. It was basically another look at the first failed attempt, and they came up with absolutely no useful conclusions whatsoever. But you tell me, because my takeaway on all of this is, here's the bottom line. The NIH, which is the organization that oversees Fauci's organization, his group was within it. They were collaborating. This is what Josh Rogan has said of the Washington Post, who's been doing great work on this. They were collaborating on very risky research with a Chinese lab that has zero transparency and zero accountability during this crisis. And no one in a position of power has been willing to address or even acknowledge that risk. In fact, Dr. Fauci appears to be arguing that the system worked, and it most clearly did not.
Yeah, and this is one among a number of judgment errors that he's made. The other incredible error, and this can't be underestimated how big an error this is to discount natural immunity. This is immunity you get if you've gotten COVID and survived. There's about 40 million people officially who have gotten COVID, but when you do antibody studies to see how many people got it and didn't know they had it, there's over 100 million people now in America who have had it through natural immunity. But he wants to pay no attention to that. So if you're 15-year-old, he wants them to mask up. But if your 15-year-old had COVID a couple of months ago, he still wants them to be vaccinated. There's no sense behind that. All of the studies are now showing that if you get COVID naturally, your immunity is at least as good as a vaccine. In fact, some studies are showing it might even be better. Now, that's not an encouragement to get it. It's a deadly disease. You don't want COVID, particularly for those at risk. But it is an argument for, my goodness, we have thousands of hospital workers when there was no vaccine who risked their lives every day. I was there with them, taking care of patients as COVID was going through the roof. The ones who got COVID and survived, don't they deserve to be given the credit for having had the disease instead of saying, oh, we're going to now fire you from the hospital unless you get vaccinated? Vaccine mandates that ignore natural immunity, ignore the science, are unscientific, and should not be adhered to or promulgated by the government.
It's crazy. People are losing their jobs, their travel rights, all sorts of access rights, who have had COVID, who have natural immunity, just because they don't want to take the vaccine too. It goes against everything we know, even if we're not doctors like you are, about how one develops immunities. It's the reason why I can take care of my kids who have terrible stomach viruses and they can breathe all over me and I don't get sick, because I'm 50 and I've had a lifetime worth of exposure to these viruses that they're just now coming into. And we don't ignore that when it comes to a parent taking care of a child, but we ignore it here when we're actually firing people and taking away their liberty for not getting these vaccinations. It's unfair.
Dr. Fauci is also risking lives every day with misinformation on the mask. So if you're 80 years old and your spouse has COVID and you're staying with them, and this is what happens across America, you're staying with your spouse to take care of them, you're intimately with them, you're helping them get food and clothing, you're taking care of your spouse. If you wear a cloth mask, you're putting yourself at risk because there's no value in a cloth mask. So by telling people that all masks are the same and that they all work, he's really putting people at home. He should be telling people, number one, if you're dealing with someone at home, wear an N95 mask. But number two, he should also be telling people that there is a treatment. The IV monoclonal antibodies can save your life. They're now approved even for a spouse that's not yet sick or positive. They take it and it's an 85% reduction in hospitalization or death. But instead, Dr. Fauci utilizes all of his 20 interviews a day to talk about putting masks on that don't work, bad information, misinformation. And I've yet to see an interview where he's telling people there's a window of time, and if you miss it, you can't get the treatment. Monoclonal antibodies, they don't give them the first day, but they also don't give them the last day before you're on the ventilator. There's a window of time as you're getting sicker, you're eligible. But if you miss that window of time and you get admitted to the hospital, they won't give you the monoclonal antibodies.
Florida's doing a lot with that now, I know. And you know, on the mask front, we're gonna cover that a little bit later about, you know, the local authorities say it helps. It helps when it comes to adults, but with respect to children, there's no data to support this, the use of masks in schools. And in fact, the CDC's own study suggests of 80,000 kids that they don't do anything, that they're actually not valuable at all to children in schools. But I'll get into that in 1 second with my next guest. But I want to ask you, what should happen to Dr. Fauci now? Because I mean, it seems clear from these documents that he did mislead Congress. He might have been trying to pull some sort of semantic trick on you. But you tell me, what should the DOJ be doing? What should Congress be doing? And should he be fired?
Absolutely, he should be fired immediately. We've referred him for a criminal referral to the Department of Justice because lying to Congress is a felony, punishable up to 5 years. But at the very least, he should be fired because the misinformation he is giving out is threatening lives. Number one, on masks that don't work, but number two, on not promoting the one treatment that everybody in America needs to know about. And this is IV monoclonal antibodies. And so, yes, absolutely, he should be fired.
So do you think there will be any follow-up, you know, given that obviously it's a Democratic administration that is siding with Fauci? Will there be any follow-up for this?
I don't think that there'll be anything done by the Department of Justice. I think they'll be politicized and there won't be any judgment. As far as him being fired, we know that where everybody was once listening and thinking he was an objective scientist, now that they know that there was a cover-up on the Wuhan thing, that 8 of his scientists immediately told him it looked like it came from a lab. And then within days, he's emailing all night. And within days, they have meetings and everybody now is on the same page. They've changed their mind as to whether or not this came from a lab. This looks to me very much like a cover-up, but he's lost a great deal of credibility. But now he's involved with telling us whether we can play football, whether we can be in the park, whether baseball should be played. He's become so incredibly full of himself that his dictates now are seen as merely the ramblings of somebody who's an elitist, who doesn't care about individual liberty, and really probably has a conflict of interest when it comes to where the virus actually originated. He says, I am science. Just to your point about the media, CNN's Jim Sciutto interviewed Fauci hours after the Intercept report broke and didn't ask him a single question about it. You know what he asked him to do? To tee off on Ron DeSantis. It's just a shameful statement of how our media handles this kind of thing today. You'd think everybody would want to get to the bottom of what our government did when it comes to funding this kind of research that led to a lot of deaths, ultimately. And so it doesn't happen again.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm for it not happening again.
But I got to ask you this before I let you go, because I know that you wrote this op-ed in early August on Fox saying, you know, resist mask mandates, choose freedom. I have people write me all the time saying, how? You know, my kid can't go to school if I don't put the mask on him. They'll kick him out. My boss is telling me I can't enter the building unless I get this vaccine. What can I do?
And it's hard because, you know, I have 3 kids, but my kids are now grown. I don't have to fight the same battles. But I see people fighting the battle at the level of the school board, go to the school board meetings, sound off. If you're able to teach your kids at home, teach them at home. If you're able to go to private school, go to private school. We're seeing the biggest growth in homeschooling and private schooling that we've ever seen because people want their kids to learn. If you look at who's suffering the most from all of these lockdowns and absent schools and virtual schools, it's poor kids and minority kids. And so we've got to push back. This is a time when we try to talk about educational choice, school choice. I have a bill in Washington that says that the federal funds that go with poor kids, they should follow the poor kid wherever the poor kid wants to go. If the kid wants to go to a private school, a church school, a non-secular school, homeschool, the funds should follow the child, and we should have school choice. And guess what? Competition will improve the scores that are languishing throughout our country.
Wouldn't that be nice? Senator, so great to see you again. Thank you for everything you've been doing on this.
Thank you.
All the best.